one of the things that you need to understand is Shakespeare did not make up the plot or anything in the story. He actually basically took events that, according to his sources, had happened in ancient Roman history and turned them into a story that people in Elizabethan England would have enjoyed and understood. And just so basically, Shakespeare lived, in the late 1500s and early 1600s, but the historical events or approximately the historical events that took place somewhere around 50, 52 A.D. So right about the time when the Roman Empire was in place, fully in place, and Julius Caesar was in power. So that gives you an idea that there was even a huge gap between the time that Shakespeare wrote the plays down and the time that the actual events took place. But there's an intermediate step here. Shakespeare didn't make it up. Instead, he stole it from this guy named Plutarch. And Plutarch is, he was a Greek who was living in Rome probably around 50 to 100 years after the actual events that he wrote about took place. And Plutarch basically wrote a series of essays, and in fact, you can, there's a full text version at this website through the University of Chicago. And Wikipedia has actually an overview of what Plutarch's parallel lives and who he wrote about. And what he did is he basically wrote essays in which he said that there were a lot of similarities between these Greek leaders over here and then these Roman leaders over here. And so you try to compare the lives of an ancient Greek person to one of the Roman leaders, because obviously Greece rose first and then fell to Rome, and Rome kind of hijacked a lot of the ideas of Greece and kind of made them their own as well, and was then more militarily successful. So Plutarch wrote these essays, and he's the source of Shakespeare's stories. Now, why would Shakespeare be reading Plutarch's parallel lives? Well, when Shakespeare was a student, basically education required that you had to learn how to read and write in Latin, because Latin was the language of the learned. It was if you wrote an academic paper in England, you should write it in Latin, because if somebody in Germany wanted to read it, they could read the Latin better than they could read, say, the regular English. So Latin was what he had to learn, and one of the things that he had to do was read all of these classics in Latin and then translate them into English, and then vice versa. Given these classics in English, he had to translate them back into Latin, which is how he learned, but also that's how he read as many of the different things he did, like Ovid's Metamorphoses, Plutarch's Parallel Lives. He also had to do some work with the Earl of Holinshed's Chronicles of England, Scotland, and Ireland. But a lot of his sources, in fact, his main source for all of the Greek and the Latin plays, or Greek and Roman-based plays, like Julius Caesar, Antony and Cleopatra, Coriolanus, they all came from Plutarch's Parallel Lives and the descriptions that are in there. So with that being said, let's talk about then some of the things from Plutarch's Parallel Lives and some of the history. Some historians contend that Julius Caesar, as a person, was the greatest military general of all time. And the reason being is he is one of two people to successfully cross this English Channel right here between France and England in a military expedition. The second person was William the Conqueror, nearly 1,000 years later. But that was considered a great military achievement because nobody's actually done it since, even though war has changed and technology has increased, etc. He was primarily a military general, which is how he rose. He was part of what was called the first triumvirate. Tri meaning three, and then umvirate being people in charge. So 3 people ruling at the same time. This first triumvirate was made up of 3 people: Crassus, Pompey, and Caesar. Both Pompey and Caesar were military guys. Crassus, on the other hand, had more of a background in banking and money, less so in military, even though he did have some. So naturally, they got rid of Crassus first. And then the civil war between Pompey and Caesar started to take place, and Caesar ultimately won in that civil war. I think that it's worth noting, too, that Caesar well, we would call him notorious. He actually, in addition to being married to Calpurnia, engaged in relations with other women, including Servilia, who was Marcus Brutus's mother. And that is according to Plutarch's life of Marcus Brutus and of Caesar that indeed took place. And it is believed that Brutus might be Caesar's biological son, and that to a certain extent Caesar kind of knew it. So that's kind of a big deal. And in fact, if you look at the statues of Brutus and you look at the statues of Caesar, you'll see that there's an awful lot of similarities between the two. Unfortunately, they did not have the benefit of Maury Povich back then to tell them whether or not he was or was not the father. So during the Civil War, one of the clues, too, that Caesar kind of thought this, realized that Brutus was his son, is that during the Civil War with Pompey, Brutus had joined Pompey. But when Caesar was winning the war, etc., he made direct orders that Brutus was not to be captured or executed, and that he had to wait for Brutus to surrender and to treat him nicely. And that was uncharacteristic of the times and of Caesar. And so people tended, and later you'll hear Mark Antony say that Caesar, in the play, Caesar said that Brutus was his angel, because even in the Civil War he was nice to him. Another fun fact about Caesar is he had what was called the falling sickness, or otherwise known as epilepsy. In fact, the name Caesar comes from the name Julius Caesar. And these are actually some words that come from Caesar's name: a seizure, a caesura, which is a stop in the middle of a line of poetry, usually denoted by a period, a dash, a semicolon, or a colon, is named after Caesar, clearly through the spelling. The word Tsar, which is like the essentially a king in Russian, and for Russia has that name, and the same thing with a cesarean section, which is the birth when you cut the baby out through the stomach rather than because it's having difficulty getting out of the other exit. So, long story short, those words all come from this time period and from him. Then from Plutarch's Parallel Life of Marcus Brutus, and who is the main character of the play, he really was, in history, noble, well-liked, and considered good by the people. He did subscribe to the philosophy of Stoicism. He believed that one should remain calm and moderate regardless of good or bad happenings, and that reason and logic should rule what you do. Rather than somebody like, say, Cassius, who is flies off the handle and uses his emotions. He really did believe that he was killing Caesar for the good of Rome and to avoid monarchy. And in fact, most historians attribute the good parts of killing Caesar to Brutus, and all of the barbaric ones to Caius Cassius, which we'll learn about later. Another character in the play, according to history, is Mark Antony. Mark Antony was a military general as well. He was known because he loved to party and drink and have all kinds of fun. That's one of the reasons why in Act 1, Scene 2, he's running around in the feast of the Lupercal. But later on, too, you'll see that will kind of be a fatal flaw. If you ever read Antony and Cleopatra, you'll find out about his flaw. One of the most important characters in this play, and he doesn't really appear in the play until they allude to him in Act 3, and he actually appears in Act 4, is Octavius Augustus Caesar. And he later becomes Emperor of Rome, and he's known in your history books as, during the time of Pax Romana, which means Roman peace. And we'll talk more about that here in a second. Now, there are strange happenings in history that emerge in the play. Now, I shouldn't say history here. What I should say is stuff that Plutarch said happened. We don't actually know for sure that all of this stuff happened, but we know that some of it did happen, and some of it is kind of suspect to believe it happened. But in history, he was offered a crown 3 times, although it took place over the course of several years, not all at once like the way that it's depicted in Act 1, Scene 2. Another interesting fact, Caesar had actually referred to Brutus and Cassius as skinny men, and that he preferred to have fat men around him. Later on in the play, he says, "Jan Cassius has a lean and hungry look. Such men, he thinks too much. Such men are dangerous." That that isn't what he exactly said. He says it in the play, but he said that in the context of the conversation that he had, and I read that in Plutarch's Parallel Life of Caesar. Calpurnia, Caesar's wife, indeed had a nightmare that Caesar was being stabbed and bleeding while many senators smiled and bathed their hands in blood. That's according to Plutarch's Parallel Life. So when that actually comes about in Act 2, I believe, that's it. That was something that Shakespeare took from his source and put it in. According to Plutarch's Parallel Lives, the augurs really did cut open a lion to tell the future, and it was supposedly missing a heart. I don't believe this claim, but it's what Plutarch said. But it's used to dramatic effect in Julius Caesar. Now, just to give you a heads up, people are like, what's an augur? An augur is basically like what Miss Cleo is today. Call me now for your free psychic reading. But the difference is, instead of reading cards, augurs cut open animals and predict the future. That'll be on a quiz, just FYI. A lion was running around in the capital the night prior to Caesar's murder. This was also according to Plutarch's Parallel Lives. A comet was seen. Supposedly there were meteor showers. There was supposedly an owl perched in the marketplace at noon. Supposedly there were earthquakes. Fire supposedly shot out of the hand of a slave of some sort. Those are all things that Plutarch reported as happening, but Shakespeare then takes that and puts that in the plot of the play to really emphasize the complication and the rising action of the plot, etc. In history, it is absolutely true that Caesar died at the foot of Pompey's statue, which is kind of interesting because Caesar and Pompey were mortal enemies when the two of them were alive, and to think that Pompey being dead, Caesar's dead and he's dead at the foot of the statue. This happened in history, according to Plutarch as well. There was a senator named Popilius Lana who supposedly had no idea that the conspiracy was taking place, but he walks up to Cassius on the day that they're about to stab Caesar and says, "I hope your endeavors go really good today." And then Popilius goes and speaks directly to Caesar, but clearly Caesar did not know about the conspiracy, or Popilius Lana didn't. But Shakespeare uses that incident to show Cassius, because Cassius kind of flies off the handle when Popilius Lana says that to him. It was in Plutarch's Parallel Life. Shakespeare used it to characterize Cassius, and also to show Brutus just being calm about it. Portia is one of the coolest characters in the history of mankind. Actually, she isn't. She's crazy. But Brutus's wife actually in history committed suicide by eating fire, which basically means, because she was locked in her room, and basically how did this happen? When Brutus was run out of Rome, when the riot took place after Mark Antony's speech to the plebeians, because Brutus gets kicked out of Rome, his wife was left there, and so she basically got captured, and so she was left in a room in which there was a fire burning and on the hearth, and she picked up the hot coals and ate them as a form of suicide. Kind of a hot way to die. Brings new meaning to the phrase, drop it like it's hot. Anyway, enough jokes about that. Cassius commits suicide on his birthday. That's actually true according to Plutarch's Parallel Life, and it's interesting because then Shakespeare kind of uses it for effect. And then here's the last two things about history that you need to know going into the play. Antony and Octavius, even though they're allies in the battles against Brutus and Cassius, later start fighting for dominance of the entire world. Antony, Octavius, and Lepidus are part of what is called the Second Triumvirate, and Lepidus is probably the least powerful military general, and once again, he's kind of like Crassus from the First Triumvirate. He's the money man, and therefore it was easy for the other two to get rid of him. But they later engage in a huge civil war, and Octavius is victorious. If you want to read Shakespeare's versions of the events that caused Octavius to win that war and Antony to bite the dust, the play Antony and Cleopatra is actually the sequel to the play Julius Caesar, and it's actually a pretty good read. Then Octavius is later named Emperor of Rome, which makes him essentially the monarch, the king, and What's ironic about this is, and irony is when there's a discrepancy between what you expect versus what actually happens. Brutus killed Julius Caesar because it was for the good of Rome and to prevent monarchy. But ultimately what happened is that monarchy came to be because he killed Caesar. And this is one of those great, and it's a theme of the play too, the road to downfall is paved with good intentions. You might think that you're doing things for the right reason, but that doesn't ultimately mean that you're going to have a good end. So in either case, I think that this is one of the interesting parts of this play that happened in history according to Plutarch's Parallel Lives, but also as part of the play. There's some other things that took place, but these are essentially, if you know that these events take place in history or were part of Plutarch's Parallel Lives, it's going to be a lot easier for you to understand and comprehend the play. Okay, on a final note, I omitted some stuff in my original lecture, so I'm going to finish it up here. Some other things that came from Plutarch's Parallel Lives of Caesar and Brutus and some of the other noble and Romans and Greeks that Shakespeare used is that Brutus and Cassius's forces did indeed come together at the field of Sardis. You can look up where that is on Wikipedia. And indeed Cassius is overruled by Brutus because they were making some battle decisions and some plans. The debate actually happens in Act 4, Scenes 2 and 3. Also, just want to point out, too, that Cassius had given advice to Pompey during the civil war between Pompey and Caesar, and Cassius was actually on Pompey's side. And he had given some advice to Pompey that Pompey didn't follow, and the net result was that Pompey lost that battle and the civil war, for that matter. That's why Cassius is kind of angry that Brutus won't listen to him this time. And ultimately Cassius was not just overruled by Brutus, but by Pompey, and both of those things had led to disaster in history. Also, according to Plutarch's Parallel Lives, Brutus supposedly saw an apparition in his tent at the field of Sardis. Now, according to Plutarch, it was just an apparition. Shakespeare kind of took it as the ghost of Caesar and used it for dramatic effect. But in either case, that's another historical point that made its way into the play. And then on the final note, Brutus was indeed at last defeated at the plains of Philippi. Philippi, if you want to look on a map, is in about modern-day Macedonia. It's a little bit north and east of Greece and kind of near the coast, if you look it up. There's an extensive description of the battle on Wikipedia that is pretty darn accurate and good. So if you're interested in finding out what that battle was actually like militarily, and according to Plutarch and some of the other historians that have written about it, that's a good source for you. So those are the things that happened in history according to Plutarch that Shakespeare used in the play for dramatic effect.